right, hello, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. I hope you can all hear me, first of all. Thumbs up if you can hear me. I can see all my panelists on. Great. Good afternoon, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. My name is Didi Akin-Lure, and it's an honor to be your moderator for this Africa CEO webinar. I'm going to wait a few seconds just to let people register. I can see the numbers are coming up now. And I see people registering. So I'm just going to give it maybe 30 seconds for everyone to come on. Right, let's do that. I'm still very much watching those numbers. I think maybe we can just get going. If everyone agrees, I think we can just start going, and people will continue to log on. I do have quite an introduction to get through anyway, so I might as well do that. This is a 75-minute session, and we're focusing today on African cities and asking if we are ready for a new generation of infrastructure here in Africa. So this webinar will explore ways that African governments and decision makers can plan resilient infrastructure to cater to the needs of rapid urbanization. See, we have more people on. As you all probably know, Africa has one of the fastest urbanization rates in the world, yet our cities still face challenges with decent housing, congestion, and worsening air quality. And also the majority of COVID-19 cases are said to be in cities and urban areas. The pandemic has underscored the need for reliable, sustainable, and affordable infrastructure and energy. So we need to focus on smart cities and also more environmentally friendly, tech-enabled infrastructure. So today we're asking how African decision makers plan resilient urban infrastructure that will stand the test of time and future uncertainties. Now, this is a third in a webinar series on infrastructure development in Africa in partnership with Africa 50. We'd like this to be an interactive session, and welcome if you're just joining us. I see more people logging in. We'd like this to be an interactive session. We do have a Q&A section, a Q&A box there somewhere, just below on your right. So please join in the conversation. Leave your questions, and towards the end of the webinar, we hope to take some of those questions. There will also be 2 interactive polls, which will be launched during the conference. So please look out for that and send in your votes. You can also participate on Twitter by using the hashtag ACF Digital Events. Right, so before we get going, I would also like you guys to save the date for the next Africa CEO Forum Annual Summit, which is taking place on the 21st and 22nd of March next year in Abidjan. So please save the date for that and register. I'm waiting for that screen to come up. Yeah, I think that's already been done. Now, in this webinar, we'll be hearing from inspiring leaders structured around an expert presentation, 2 guest speakers, and an interesting panel discussion. So to kick things off today, we will start with a presentation from our expert. Expert today is James Wangi, a Global Executive Director at Dalberg Group, but he is represented this afternoon by Mokena Maketa. Mokena is a principal at Dalberg. He's been an architect and urban planner for the past 18 years, and with Dalberg, he's an integral lead of the Dignified and Green Livelihoods initiatives and serves on the WEF initiative 30% by 2030. So I'll pass over now to Mokena, and then we shall continue with the rest of the discussion. Mokena, over to you.
Thank you very much, Didi, for a wonderful introduction. Thank you to all of the listeners. It's a real pleasure to be here to share some reflections on a topic which is important to all of us, albeit from different perspectives. We have about 7 minutes to essentially dive into a picture of what climate smart cities could mean for Africa's future. Current thinking is now veering us towards this direction where when we talk about smart cities, it's no longer just about technological development or about infrastructure, but its intersection with climate smart potentials. And these climate smart potentials engage with the issues of community, let's call it community responsiveness, understanding ecological equity, and also understanding how do we reduce our carbon footprint. And in the context of our particular cities, from an African perspective, these are very, very cogent and important questions. Next slide. So as has been said by my colleague there, African cities are growing rapidly, and they require a different developmental model from the current growth perspective. It needs to be inclusive, sustainable, and equitable. The pressure on cities continues to grow. Africa's population will be doubling by 2050, and new models are required that can begin to address the inequalities that afflict our urban environments, but also ensuring that rural development is also taken into account. Next slide. Now, climate smart urbanization can turn key challenges into drivers for growth and innovation. And what do we mean by that? This goes to the heart of how do we plan our cities and towns? How do we imagine our buildings? And how do we make our cities work? But these infrastructural systems that need to be reimagined are not just about the bricks and mortar or the assembly of buildings per se, but it's also about the governance systems that we put in place, the economic strategies that we begin to imagine that could enable these sorts of new environments, but also how do we strategically begin to unlock the potential for climate smart financing in the way that we fund infrastructure, in the way that we create revenues, and the type of building and infrastructure models that go into the making of cities. Next slide. Some of these challenges have direct opportunities in terms of how we think of alternative building materials, but also the way that we imagine our cities, both from an urbanization and densification perspective. All of the data shows us that low density cities give us particular challenges with regards to carbon footprint, with the amount of capital that is set aside for infrastructure per capita, but also has the impact of urban sprawl impacting on natural and pristine environments. So how do we get to a point where we have increased compact urbanization that allows us to not only protect nature, but at the same time actually reduce the amount of surface area that these developments are taking, and in so doing concentrate capital that can be fed back to make more equitable and more inclusive societies. So densification is a big part of the infrastructure narrative. There are many examples of where infrastructure has failed to be affordable, not because the infrastructure itself was too expensive, but the ratio at which that infrastructure is meant to support a given amount of people or so-called carrying capacity. So densification is key towards economic success as well as infrastructure efficiency. Next slide. Passive cooling and high efficiency cooling techniques are an important part of this equation because energy contributes a substantial amount of the burden when it comes to climate change, but also the functioning of cities. Passive cooling speaks to how we think about the spacing between buildings, how we think about the surface and materials, whether it's glass or shielded buildings, but it's also about how do we make sure that the environments that we design are actually far much more in tune with the environments that they're in. Very often we see designs imported from very different climate contexts, which are not suited to our place and effectively create infrastructure and architecture that is not suited and becomes very, very expensive. So we need to radically reimagine how building codes can be purpose-made towards our own context, our own materials, our own skills, but importantly, our own resources. And there are a number of actors in that space, such as the World Building Council, that are beginning to do this and others. But we need to take this far much more down to the level of how do governments support these innovative building codes and support developers, and how does the banking sector also support these innovations so that these designs become far much more affordable once you look at the total value chain of developmental costs. Next slide. Through our own work at Dalberg, we've managed to demonstrate that innovative and alternative building materials can have a huge impact in terms of reducing footprint, and particularly the carbon footprint of a typical building. This particular project, which I'm proud to say that I designed with my colleagues for Gabon, demonstrated a huge and substantial reduction of carbon through the use of CLT, glulam, and LVL These are essentially wood substitutes for your traditional concrete and steel structures, demonstrating that a single building could save 1.5 million kilograms of carbon compared to a traditional building, which across its lifetime would emit 1 million kilograms of carbon. So we can anticipate that in future, climate smart infrastructure that wants to tie into green bonds, that wants to tie into the amount of capital that is being released in order for the world to stay within the 1.5-degree limit, is going to require us to be very innovative about how we think about material choices, the planning of our cities, and the type of infrastructure that we use. And of course, these are not just feel-good gestures, but have a dramatic financial implication, as well as opportunity for new businesses and new climate-smart businesses to emerge from these sorts of approaches. Next slide. This is my penultimate slide. I think it's quite an important one, particularly when we talk about smart cities and how do we reimagine African cities. On the bottom left-hand corner, we have what we call the status quo. This is where we have small middle-class enclaves, some degree of capital, but by the main, slum neglect. Up towards that, you find that there's what we call the green status quo, the sort of idea of new towns, pockets of greening, and some minimal slum upgrading. And then towards the bottom right-hand side, we have what probably many of us are quite familiar with, the notion of smart cities, smart grids, and mobility. However, all of these do not necessarily lead us to where we want to be, which is the top right-hand corner, which is inclusive and affordable cities. And those are the cities where there's intensive slum economic renewal, intensive low carbon smart grids, coupling that with ecosystem renewal, so we do not leave ecology behind when we have infrastructure conversations. But it's also about what I'd refer to as a balance of low-tech solutions. And low-tech solutions allow local communities, local actors, etc., to be part of the technological solution in the making of their cities. So as opposed to importing solutions which might come from other contexts and require very complex sets of expertise, either in the maintenance or in their construction, the city of the future that will be inclusive and affordable will be the one that acknowledges and takes into account local skills, local expertise, and builds a pathway that is inclusive and affordable. Next slide. And in closing, this allows us to perhaps anchor on where are the sort of nudge points that I think is very important for the ongoing discussion about the future of cities. The question of our energy mix and understanding what is a just energy transition. And this justice is not just about equity within our cities, but it's also about ecological justice. How do we make far much more renewable energy solutions, and microgrids are a big part of that. The role of using public transport, because again, that brings density and efficiency of infrastructure in play, ensuring connectivity, which can be digital as well as financial, so that we can ensure that more people are able to enter into the workforce and also allow shorter commutes. So that sort of digital narrative is very much an important part of infrastructure. And last but not least, the importance of not only managing waste in a circular fashion, but seeing if there are new business opportunities that can emerge from taking our waste and seeing them as inputs into new systems. Once we assemble these sort of four, let's call it brackets of thinking, it allows us to have a wide range of opportunity sets for how we can make an inclusive and affordable African city. And with that, I thank you.
Mokina Makeka, thank you so much for that presentation. Thanks so much, very insightful there. Before we continue the discussion by bringing in our panelists, we will like to take our first poll of the day. We did say that we wanted this to be as interactive as possible. As our expert just pointed out, African cities are growing rapidly, and a different development model is required for that growth to be sustainable and equitable. So how should we plan our cities and towns, our buildings, and how do we make these cities work? Right, so like I said, before we move on to the first key point, we've got a poll up there for you. Question 1, it says, in your opinion, what is the most urgent priority to improve urban planning in African cities? Those are your options: training more urban planners, letting central governments manage urban planning, letting local governments manage urban planning, or simplifying urban regulations. Right, so I'm not able to vote, so neither are the panelists, so we need you guys to please vote, and we will get those results later on today. Give you a few more seconds to do that. All right, I think that you must have all done your polls by now, so I think we can move on, and I would like to move on to our first key point of the day. This is going to be a 15-minute session. Let me start by introducing our panelists to you. So join me, ladies and gentlemen, in welcoming all our panelists today. We have Chepidi Moremong, Chief Operating Officer, Africa 50. She leads a multidisciplinary team, and she's a seasoned executive with more than 20 years of experience in private equity, corporate finance, and business development. We also have with us here today, Emmanuel Adeboye, Managing Partner, Utopia. He's leading the team's emerging efforts across Africa. And just so you know, Utopia is an urban innovation group that aims to build the urban ecosystem for emerging cities and their slums across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And we also have with us here Mama Sugufara, Managing Director, Middle East, North Africa, and Turkey, Alstom. Prior to that, he was the Managing Director for Alstom in the Middle East. So welcome all three of you to this discussion where we'll be tackling our first key point this afternoon. Now, as our expert pointed out, he talked around innovation and how much innovation is needed, and we need policies that incentivize these solutions. A few suggestions were made there, making use of innovative building materials, harnessing the continent's untapped renewable energy potential, making use of electric public transport systems, connectivity to enable remote work and shorter commutes, and managing waste in a circular way. But all of these require a significant amount of investment in new infrastructure and technology. Or perhaps we should focus on improving our existing infrastructure. So the question really is, what is the reasonable plan for Africa? I'd like all our panelists to keep your answers tight within 3 to 4 minutes, as we only have 75 minutes to get through the webinar this afternoon. And I'll start with Chepidi Moremong. Chepidi, focusing on cities and tech-enabled infrastructure, in your opinion, is Africa ready for this? And what kind of infrastructure does Africa 50 consider critical to invest in to build smart cities for Africa?
Thank you, Didi. It's a pleasure to be on this panel with the esteemed panelists, and really would like to, excited as Africa 50 to be co-sponsoring this panel. I think it's important that we create such platforms for these conversations. But before I address your question, if you can just indulge me, I'd like to just introduce who Africa 50 is. Maybe some of our participants or those who joined us, I'm not aware of Africa 50. It's good though to have friends like Ms. Delasina Kone, as well as Dr. Abu Zaid, who are friends of Africa 50 with me on this panel. So who are we as Africa 50? We're an infrastructure investment platform. We're really created to meet the infrastructure needs and really to try and see how we can bridge the gap of both infrastructure financing and development on the continent as a whole. So we have 28 African governments as our shareholders, 2 central banks, and the African Development Bank as our anchor investor. And we really have 3 strategic objectives, one of which is project development. I think what we've all come to understand is there is quite a bit of capital that can finance and fund projects on the continent. What's been difficult has always been finding the projects. So through our project development pillar, we look at working with project sponsors, African governments, in delivering bankable projects to financiers and other funders. The second pillar is what we call our project finance. And what we do this is really looking at funding, providing equity and quasi-equity for projects that are either close to financial close or post-financial close. The third pillar, also very critical, is in the mobilization of capital. How is it that we can mobilize capital to continue to bridge this infrastructure financing gap on the continent? So very pleased to let everybody here know that we recently launched our Africa 50 Infrastructure Acceleration Fund, a pure private equity fund that's targeting to raise $500 million. And we've got an incredible team of practitioners, private equity practitioners, who've got a successful track record in building private equity on the continent as a whole. So in answering your question, is Africa ready for smart cities? I think it would seem counterintuitive to speak about smart cities on a continent where we still do not have reliable electricity, running clean water, sufficient internet connectivity. And many of our urban and peri-urban areas are really characterized by sprawling, unplanned squatter settlements or slums, which, has been said before, have really developed with people looking for opportunities within the city center. But I think before we talk about this sort of counterintuitivity, I think the key thing is, how is it that we define smart cities, right? I think all of us have always seen and thought about smart cities as where we're driving technological solutions and data-driven. But I think we need to think about them as, cities that focus on sustainability. There's resource productivity. They drive economic development. We're able to create jobs for our citizens and getting the basic core infrastructure in place to enable decent quality of living for our citizens. I'd really like to emphasize this point around providing a decent quality of living for our citizens. I think Mokoena earlier also emphasized affordability. So yes, I do believe that Africa can be ready. In many instances, we are ready. We've leapfrogged technology. And I believe that, the fact that as a continent, we potentially have limited legacy infrastructure, it does create an opportunity for both innovators and investors to deliver on smart cities on the continent. I think that being said, and this is really the crux of your question, is that we critically need to ensure, though, that our foundational infrastructure is in place and efficient, if we are to use any technological solutions at all to enhance the delivery of basic services. Many of these smart city solutions are technologically driven, so it is imperative that we have a very solid fiber backbone in our countries and cities. Things such as right-of-ways, etc., to get last-mile connectivity. And also, we really need to drive access to internet and broadband connectivity to all of our homes. I think the World Bank makes an estimation that about there's a requirement of about $100 billion over the next decade in order for the continent to achieve universal broadband internet access, a third of which will be needed for infrastructure provision. Mm-hmm. I think the other area, just very quickly rounding off here, is power. The generation and distribution and access to clean energy and power for all of our citizens is going to be critical, again, in the delivery of a good and sustainable quality of life. ICT, many of our solutions, and when we think about smart cities, is are we able to collect and analyze data in order to put together what Mokoena has said, smart grids for energy efficiency, analysis of traffic patterns, security, etc. Africa has led the way with regards to payment solutions, right? So I believe we can be a leader in certain areas as pertains to smart cities, and therefore in driving the requisite technological solutions. We just need to work together. I think this is really about co-creating, coming together as multiple stakeholders to be able to deliver on this. With that, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
Didi, I hope I haven't taken too much time.
Thanks so much for that, Shepidi. From very interesting points there. We have leapfrog technology, and in many cases, according to Shepidi, we are ready for this. I want to get Mama to come in here as well, and tackle that point as well in terms of what the reasonable plan for Africa is. Some say that perhaps we should leverage physical infrastructure to connect our cities in the megalopolis model, and maybe not focus so much on trying to be smart cities. Or, so what's your view? Should we be focusing on leveraging technology here?
Thank you, Didi, and very happy to join the panel. Definitely, this is one of the critical questions, and as a company like Alsom, we are first very present in Africa. We have more than 3,000 people working in the continent. We have several factories in South Africa, in Morocco, in Algeria, and of course, delivering many projects in Egypt, in Senegal, on top of the other countries that I mentioned. So for us, giving solution and providing solution to cities is our mission. And we engage with authorities in developing infrastructure for mobility based on rail, and particularly in the urban area. And it was mentioned earlier that from now to 2050, there will be more than 1.2 billion new Africans living in cities. So the first challenge is, how do we plan for that? How do we plan in terms of right-of-way, in terms of access of land, in terms of development of the cities, particularly in the question of the mobility. And the mobility is somehow an integration factor for economy, creating jobs. People need to be mobile, to go for work, to go to the university, to school. So for us, it is one of the fundamental factors for the cities of the future, I would say, and for the smart cities. And this mobility has to be green, has to be sustainable, has to be, of course, affordable, and has to be giving access to opportunities to the citizen. So first, planning. Second, answering to the mobility challenge inside the cities. For sure, technology is part of it. And in the early presentation, it was mentioned that the electrical mobility is one of the factors that would help to avoid congestions, but as well to reduce the level of pollution that we see in many of these cities, on top of the casualties that are caused by car accidents. And this is one of the reasons that push many of the African authorities in the cities to develop mass transit using rail. This is CASA Transport in Morocco, or IEMA in Algeria. This is CETUD or APIX in Senegal for projects that we deliver, and as well in South Africa. And in the coming months, you will see the real start for Abidjan Metro. So many cities are investing a lot on heavy infrastructure to answer to these challenges. And for us, adopting technology, planning, and answering to mobility are the key factor for the future of the cities in Africa.
All right, thanks for that, Mama. Emmanuel, I'd like to bring you in here, as I know that you run a VC fund that supports African entrepreneurs seeking to solve urban issues on the continent. So I would like to hear a little more about the work that you do, who you're investing in, and the financing model that you're using, to bring in the right capital.
Yeah, thank you, Didi. First of all, I'm excited to be here, and thank you for having me on the panel. So Utopia, our work really focuses on supporting what we call urban entrepreneurs. So we launch City Labs, which are urban tech venture studios, and we're also developing the Africa Megacity Fund, which you alluded to invest in early stage entrepreneurs who we believe have the best shot at solving Africa's biggest urban challenges. And you might want to ask, why is this important? I've listened to all of the different perspectives on this panel, which are really interesting. And for me, when I think about smart cities, right, the basic definition really is about cities that are able to sense and respond to the needs of their people, right? And I would argue that innovators who, by design, have to design solutions to everyday challenges that people face are best positioned to understand what these needs are and actually build solutions to them. So when we think about the future of cities in Africa, first of all, we need to acknowledge that innovators and entrepreneurs have a huge role to play in that, right? Because, I mean, you can't even, I mean, people pay for these solutions because it's meeting their needs, right? So their incentives are aligned, basically. That's number one. And then number two is, I think that on the question of smart cities, when we talk about like smart cities in Africa, we almost tend to talk about it from a futuristic standpoint in terms of what the potential is and what the opportunities are, which is great, right? But we also need to think about what the present looks like. And no one talks about the future more than I do, but I think it's important to contextualize that within the present. What I mean by that is today, majority of our population already live in slums, right? And I mean in cities, right? Today, there's a lot of informality. There are a lot of challenges. I mean, the average Lagosian, for instance, is estimated to spend 2 months in traffic, for instance, every year, right? Now, in thinking about what the future looks like and in grounding that in sort of what I talked about earlier in terms of making sure that we're responding to the needs of citizens, it's then asking, what are the challenges that exist today, right? And what's the best way to actually find solutions to acknowledge the challenges that exist? Who are those that are solving those problems now while we're thinking about the future? So for instance, everyone on this call would agree that we need bus rapid transport systems, that we need mass railway and all of that. But then in reality, majority of our transport systems today in cities across Africa are largely informal, right? And there are innovators who are building solutions on the ground to ensure that that informality is becoming a lot less informal, right? And that they're increasing the safety ratings, for instance, and making sure that governments can actually know, like the systems are a lot more transparent. So I think that that's sort of where our work becomes really important, because we then need to acknowledge that if we're going to build towards that future, and if majority of your population today rely on existing solutions, right? Who are those doing the work to basically transform these existing solutions into what potentially would be relevant in the future, right? And that's sort of the thesis for all of the work that we do at Utopia, to say, hey, how do we create an enabling environment for these entrepreneurs to thrive, working with government stakeholders, working with other stakeholders within the urban ecosystem for sure, but how do we ensure that they are part of the solution and not, and how do we also in a lot of ways educate governments and other stakeholders to realize that that future is great, but we have to be adaptive in how we think about it, right? Working with these innovators and actually learning from them.
Right. I'd like to come back to Shepidi very, very quickly, just since we're talking about funding in some way. What funding and investment models are required to fund the right infrastructure that can adapt to changing climate conditions, in your opinion?
So Didi, I think there's no specific funding model, right? I think there's no sort of one size fits all when it comes to funding. So I think the key thing is always, when one looks at funding or financing a project, what is the revenue model, right? And therefore, if one provides financing, how is it going to be paid back? And so what this then requires is different funding models. I think traditionally, when we look at infrastructure rollout and financing on the continent, we've seen the use of PPP structures, so public-private partnership, that have been really the foundation of driving most of the infrastructure to date. But as Emmanuel has said, in the creation of city labs, in trying to nurture entrepreneurs and early stage businesses, it's critical that we look at the whole array of financing potential, which is venture capital funds. So being able to provide equity and quasi-equity for early stage businesses. Then you look at how is it that you can access debt? I think we need to think about blended finance, right? So being able to bring in a combination of consensual financing that can then catalyze, longer term commercial debt. So I think really this is a combination of looking at venture capital, private equity, looking at capital markets. Unfortunately, not all of our capital markets are deep enough, but I think it's also important that we leverage that. We've also got the likes of the pension funds, right? I think on the continent, assets under management for pension funds is estimated about $2 trillion. So what role do they play in being able to drive sustainable cities that are responsive to their citizens' needs?
All right, thanks for that. And that brings us to the end of the first key point. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as you know, we can't talk about smart cities or smart Africa without connectivity. However, limited internet access remains a major stumbling block in Africa's digital transformation. So at this point, I'd like to bring in our first guest speaker of the day to join the conversation. Lassina Kone is the Director General at Smart Africa, which is an alliance of 32 African countries, international organizations, and institutions that are tasked with Africa's digital agenda. He oversees the process of defining and advancing Africa's digital agenda. It's great to have you here with us, Mr. Kone. And I'd like to ask you, Smart Africa aims to create a single digital market in Africa by 2030. How do you plan to achieve this and coordinate this, considering the differences that we have in policies, legal framework, etc. On the continent?
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for the questions. And I'm really honored. Yeah, transforming Africa into a single, the vision is to transform Africa into a single digital market by 2030. I believe my sister, Dr. Manish, is here. We believe we can actually do it before 2030. Seriously speaking, because we have over 50 countries with the 50 different regulatory environment, with a connectivity which does not exceed 39.8% of African people connected. We have the rise of our entrepreneurs actually attracting. The recent figures shows about $2 billion this year, coming from 400 million only. So, things are booming on the entrepreneur side, and our governments, of course, are restructuring or are transforming themselves, yet not at the pace that we like. We do believe that it's quite possible. The way we do this in Smart Africa is basically every single country, the 32 countries, they have a flagship project. Those flagship is a decomposition of the entire digital transformations ecosystem, such as South Africa is championing the artificial intelligence and the blockchain. Burkina Faso is championing the capacity building. Rwanda is championing the smart city, and Kenya, and so on and so forth. Cybersecurity is in Cote d'Ivoire. So we take it from a concept note to a flagship project. It becomes a blueprint. The blueprints now we run a pilot, like we did the pilot project for smart city in Rwanda. Once we do that, and we scale up. So basically, it's a sharing the best practice among ourselves, while harmonizing the policies to be able to attract the investors into Africa. Because we all talk about Africa rising, we still need to make ourselves nice, transparent, and we can only be transparent in our different activity in our administrations if we put the ICT at the center of the social economic development. That's how exactly we do. We believe from now to 2030, we will be able to transform Africa into a single digital market, because we have today over 24 flagship projects: Digital ID, Smart Africa Trust Alliance, just named a Startup Act by Tunisia. All of these are different initiatives that we are concurrently working on them. And of course, we're working together, a very close relationship with the African Union, where Dr. Amani herself, she's the co-chair of our steering committee, and she's a permanent member. IU is a permanent member of Smart Africa.
Right, it's great to hear that, that you're on target, and you did mention some of the projects that you're working on there. I just want to know what would this mean for Africa? So hitting this target, what would this mean for Africa and investments in African infrastructure as a whole?
To transform Africa into a single digital market, it is a lot of work, but it's not impossible. And we already seen that happening for the past decade. Remember this, for the past 10 years, Africa has been the continent, the fastest growing continent in terms of internet penetrations. One, Africa is the mobile continent. Today, we control close to 70% or 60% of mobile registered in terms of mobile money. We control in Africa today close to 60% of mobile money transaction, and we control the value of the transaction up to 50%. So look at the cocktail. We have a community, we have citizens in Africa who are really embracing mobile technology and different emerging technology. Yet, when we look at who actually control the digital economy in the world, today, statistics show 70% of the digital economy is controlled by America, and 22% by China, 3.4% by Europe, and Africa control only 1.3%. Do you see this as a challenge? I see this as a challenge and also an opportunity with the rise of our young people who are 70% today represent less than 30 years old. So this is where the change will come from and unlocking the potentials in Africa, including, of course, that what my sister Shepidi mentions, which is the infrastructure investment gap, which is actually sum up to close to $109 billion, mentioned by the World Bank. It is quite feasible because you see, we all talk about technology. We have all this submarine cable around the continents in Africa. Let me tell you and share something with you. If you gather all the capacity supply in the world, submarine cable, fiber optic, satellite, it covers 96% of the entire planet. So how come Africa, we still have a 39.8% penetration in terms of adoptions of the internet? It goes back to regulatory environment. Because our regulatory environment, they are in the finite gain mentality, which means not regulatory for development. Regulation for development is completely different from a status regulation. So we need to be adaptive and embracing the new technology and changing our regulation to be able to attract the investors to Africa.
All right, thank you so much for that, Lassina. Very, very insightful there. I would now like us to take a look at, so move back a little bit to take a look at the result of the interactive poll that came up before the start of the session. So team, can we have those results? So in your opinion, what is the most urgent priority to improve urban planning in African cities? And I'm not surprised, it's simplifying urban regulations. All right, thanks so much, ladies and gentlemen. And that's exactly what you were saying there, Mr. Kode. Thanks so much for taking part in that. I would now like on to move, obviously, we haven't got much time, so we've got to move on to the second point of the day, and I welcome back our panelists. Now, regardless of whether it's a smart city or a megalopolis, we're talking about building resilient infrastructure. So the question is, how do we plan, design, and build infrastructure that will adapt to changing climate conditions and respond to users' future needs? And once again, I'd like to start with Shepidi Moramong and ask, what will it take to get African governments to focus on building resilient cities, and how is Africa 50 supporting in this regard?
So, Didi, on that, I think a couple of things. I think firstly, it'll actually take more than just African governments to deliver on building resilient cities, right? I think what's critical is really the ability for governments to harness multiple stakeholders. And that is truly what we must promote across the board. I think, as I was mentioned earlier, the infrastructure financing need on the continent, I think, is estimated between $130 to $170 billion by the African Development Bank. And I think post-COVID, we know that that requirement has even increased even further. Many of our governments have been adversely impacted. So with that financing gap, or rather financing need, our governments definitely cannot afford this. So I think what we really need is to include government. I think key for government is to create an enabling environment, right? That's really the role for government, create an enabling environment, ensure that the requisite regulatory frameworks are in place, make sure that whichever responsible institutions are working with various stakeholders are strengthened. And I think Emmanuel said it very well earlier. It's really about engaging with the government and having conversations. So it's going to be government, it's going to be innovators, it's going to be entrepreneurs, development finance institutions, private sector, infrastructure developers, all coming together in order for us to deliver on building on these resilient cities. And I think, really with the increased pressure on our governments, especially, or rather increased pressure on our various cities, I think it's also important not just to think about building resilient cities, but how do we also look at improving our rural areas, right? Most of the pressure that we're facing in our cities is because of migration, people looking for additional opportunities. So how do we also ensure that we're developing our rural communities to curtail or limit this movement? And if you ask the question what our role as Africa 50 is, our role is really to support governments, to support our stakeholders, being infrastructure developers and sponsors. And this is by working with them in several fronts, right? I talked about earlier our project development arm, which is focused on delivering and bringing early and greenfield projects to bankable stage. And this, as far as I'm concerned, is really part of how we would contribute to the creation or building of smart cities. The sectors that we focus on, ICT, which is critical. Everybody's been talking about sort of mass transit and green transportation. So we look at transport and logistics, very keen, and I've been looking at projects within electrical vehicles. Power and energy, as I've said, are going to be critical for the foundation, really, for being able to deliver most of this. Health and education. How is it that we can deliver education to the home? I think COVID has shown us that that is going to be necessary. So as an organization, that's really what we're looking to do, and this is how we're looking to support our governments and entrepreneurs and project sponsors. I'm also really excited to let everybody know that tomorrow we'll be unveiling the master plan of Kigali Innovation City in Rwanda, right? And this is what is, through this investment and working together with the government of Rwanda, we're driving innovation. This is a joint development with the government of Rwanda where there's a creation of an innovation hub, where Rwanda looks to set itself up as a center for technology and exporting that across the continent and worldwide. Thank you, Didi.
Thanks so much for that. Interesting points there. Important for the government to create an enabling environment and different stakeholders all coming together to build on resilient cities. You also talked about how we need to improve our rural areas and focus on areas such as power and energy, health and education. I'd like you to bring you in here, Emmanuel. Perhaps you'd like to add to that, to some of those points that Shipidi mentioned. And also perhaps you could tackle this as well, because, we talk a lot about funding and creating new projects, infrastructure projects. What are your thoughts? Should we also be focusing on improving our current infrastructure, perhaps maybe instead of actually funding new ones?
Yeah, thank you. I agree 100% with Shapiri. I think that if governments could do one thing, I think that they should literally just focus on creating an enabling environment for entrepreneurial energy on the continent. What I mean by that is, it's clear to everyone on this call that governments alone can't solve all the problems. It's clear to everyone on this call that we don't even have the funding to solve all of these issues. But what's also clear is that we have a majority young population, as Blasina mentioned earlier, a lot of whom are really, really entrepreneurial. Yeah. What if we change our mindset and say, how do we create an enabling environment for these young people to not just try to solve problems for our majority young population, but actually create platforms for them to become the ones solving the problems. It takes a change of mindset, but I think that if we can achieve that, that would be the one thing that I would say that governments need to focus on, quite frankly. But to that point as well, I would say that from that standpoint, it's then thinking about infrastructure development. And to your second question around, should we be improving what exists or building infrastructure? I think that we need to do both, but I think that it needs to be phased, right? I think that the entrepreneurs and innovators should be at the center of that. So it's saying that, what are they building today, right? And what's needed to ensure that there is a catalytic environment, as it were, for them to scale some of these innovations. I think that the challenge is that there is a gap between, there's a huge gap, I would say, or a missing middle, as it were, between growing early stage startups, as it were, into becoming really large organizations that can handle large, massive projects. A lot of times, the organizations that have the capacity to develop this or to implement these really large solutions didn't actually really go through that whole early stage growth process. And I think that that's something that needs to address. My recommendation would be, how do we ensure that some of these early stage startups, for instance, can actually be integrated into how public service is delivered, for instance? So that's one practical thing that governments can do. So take, for instance, let's use waste management in a city, for instance, right? We all know that like waste is an issue. How do we ensure that some of the solutions that early stage entrepreneurs are building in terms of even just like sorting, in terms of tracking waste and things like that, get integrated into how local public waste management is done? That solves a lot of problems on the one hand, because these local entrepreneurs are creating jobs. They're closest to the problems, right? But they're also helping, quote unquote, governments deliver on their responsibilities, but not necessarily putting all of the responsibilities on government, but saying that, what do you need, right? And how do we ensure that we create that platform? So if it means, for instance, simplifying how early stage entrepreneurs can participate in public bids, then that should be the responsibilities of government. If it means creating startup acts like Lassina mentioned, to ensure that more funding that provides investor confidence, for instance, or that provides incentives for these startups, then that's the role of government, right? But it's that sort of thinking that then makes it possible to say, hey, yes, we have these infrastructure challenges, but we're going to solve them together. But we're going to empower young people, young innovators, to be able to actually solve the problem, not we trying to solve the problems for young people, if that makes sense.
All right, and thanks for that, Emmanuel. And Mama, in your role, you work with a host of clients in implementing new infrastructure. So what are some of the key issues that you consider in building resilient and sustainable infrastructure that will stand the test of time and future uncertainties, Mama?
I think one of the important point that I share from the point that was raised is how the central government and the local government on the mobility are addressing the topic. Very often, there is a need of stronger collaboration between these levels because of the gap in terms of capabilities to plan and execute this type of project. And we have seen very interesting model in Algeria, in Morocco, in Senegal with the Institute, in South Africa, where government is taking in charge this capacity building for the planning of the projects. And then the local government, the municipalities, the regional government are taking in charge the delivery of part of the project that are able to manage. So the collaboration between the different level of authorities is very important to clarify the responsibilities, but also to give to the local level the capacity to decide and to manage the investment. Because as we know in the financing of these projects, very often the municipality do not have the means to raise the fund for this type of project. So very often the government has to provide sovereign guarantee or subsidize or raise even from the market debt to support this investment. So this is also an important aspect, how from a financing point of view, the different local actors are engaged with the government in order to raise the fund for this infrastructure. Last but not least, the population has to have a platform in which they are engaged in the planning and in the execution of the project. And very often when we execute a project, of course, we are talking about a railway line, which is crossing the city over several kilometers. And the challenge of expropriation, the challenge of what for me on this project, depending on the places in which the line is going through, is extremely important. So there is always an ecosystem that need to be combined to be successful in the implementation of the infrastructure project like the mobility and the railway.
All right, thanks so much, Mama. I think at this point I'd like to bring in our next guest speaker. Her Excellency Dr. Amani Abuzaid is Commissioner for Infrastructure and Energy at the African Union Commission. It's an honor to have you here with us. She is the twice elected African Union Commissioner in charge of infrastructure, energy, and ICT. Dr. Mani, welcome. I would like you to talk through some of the AU strategies and programs in place to develop resilient infrastructure on the continent. And perhaps there are some key projects or success stories that you'd like to highlight for us.
Yes, thank you very much, Didi. And allow me first to acknowledge and thank all of you for inviting me for this very exciting and distinguished panel. I've learned a lot over the last minutes, and allow me maybe before I get into what projects specifically the African Union have been developing in that regard, maybe to also comment on some of the fundamental things that started this discussion. Allow me to object to the term smart or megapolis. Every city of every size can be smart. So it's not one or the other. It's how to make whatever city that we have, or a place or a community that we have, and turn it into a livable, sustainable, and better connected to serve its people and its community. So that's the purpose. So it's not one or the other, but it's the purpose for all of us here, I believe, is that how to make our communities, our cities, our villages, our secondary cities, and our large cities are a better, provide a better living for the people and better serve the communities, also allow them to grow in a healthy manner. And don't be surprised, I'm speaking to you while I'm talking to you, you'll be hearing the cars all around me. So very much to the topic and the theme of this panel. So it's part of my background. Now, the second point is that was also raised during the discussion is the issue of, that poll that you put. You put simplify regulations. The problem, in my opinion, is not just to, or the issue is not to simplify regulations, but to improve regulations, to make them work for this new and this thinking of, how to make our cities sustainable, how to make them smart, how to better serve the people, how to allow for the cities to also cater for these creative, innovative ideas. So this is the kind of regulations that we are looking for. Last but not least, we keep mentioning urban, rural. Remember, and I would like to remind everybody about with the realities that we are all facing in Africa. Africa is not only urban and rural. but there's also the peri-urban, the secondary cities. We have the slums. We have the informal settlements, which are neither here nor there. And these are real issues and big problems that all our planners, policy makers, governments, local governments are struggling with. So just a reminder that it's not a clear cut as it's maybe seemed to have been mentioned during this session. So just a reminder of how our cities grew. They did not follow the model plan, develop, occupy. They did not grow like that. Many of those cities also are historical cities where you are not allowed even to change anything because they are historical sites within the cities in which we live. So many of these things come into play just to show how complex urban development is in Africa, and there is no one size fits all, like my sister Chipidi says. Every city, every community has to be, the planning has to be bespoke, and the kind of infrastructure, smart and green, even to be planned and tailored to that specific place and this specific community. So this is just to also give you the frame within which we move at the African Union and in Africa in general. Now, going back to your question, the African Union is this, if you will, this apex organization that has all African countries as members, and with the purpose of creating a one united and prosperous continent. And my portfolio, we do have transport, energy, and digitalization. And for each of these sectors, there are multiple initiatives, either in developing or promoting the development of energy in a particularly renewable energy accelerated across the continent in all sizes, whether it's mini or off-grid and or the large programs, regional and transcontinental, to the point, last June we launched to start, the single African electricity market, or other initiatives under the EU, like the single digital market, as well as, specific projects within regional and transcontinental to link and bind the continent in all infrastructure matters, which is the program for infrastructure development in Africa. This is the second phase that goes from 2021 to 2030. These are regional and transcontinental projects in the areas of transport, of water, of digital, and of transport, equally for each region in Africa and equally by sector as well. It's a consultative, bottom-up selection, screened in detail, also going in the direction where my sister Chipidi was talking, that it's important to have bankable projects benefiting from many or could benefit from many financing instruments, including the one set up by Africa 50, but also other instruments like the Infrastructure Preparation Fund that we are doing with the African Development Bank and other possibilities. And also, in the space within transport and energy, also cater for, or there is so many things have happened specifically over the last 2-3 years, where increased interest by all governments, especially our governments, in electrified mass transportation, in railways has been recognized now as also contributor to a climate-friendly agenda, whereas in the past, if you look at the narrative before, you would not see many, even internationally, they were not talking about railways. Now everybody understands that railways can take a lot off, the roads and help with that. In energy, well, and in the fuel for cars, one of our agenda is also the road safety charter of the African Union. And road safety for us is not just about the proper design of the road to save lives, but also to limit or to eliminate the unfit cars on our roads and streets. Those cars that are either used or substandard, just sent to Africa, or the ones that are polluting. And I'm really happy to see now there's a movement across the continent. It started, and it's building momentum to use natural gas, which is a much lower emitter, much cleaner than petrol. There are even attempts for starting, to use even electric cars in smaller cars, for private use, and so on and so forth. So I'll go back to your very first, the opening sentence of this session, is Africa ready? And let me just say a firm yes. Africa is very much ready, despite all the challenges and despite all the problems. Africa has always proved that it is ready. And while we are trying to remedy and retrofit, into these many serious problems that we are having, we are very fast embracing the future, and we wanted to work better for our people. Taking an example from the country where I am speaking to you from right now, in Egypt. Egypt is building a new capital with the latest technology, and at the same time is providing fast internet, high-speed internet to 1,400 villages, and making sure that all the villages now will be equipped with a high-speed internet and natural gas for cooking, eliminating the kerosene and firewood forever. And not to mention that over the last 3 years, slums have been, completely removed from the face of Egypt. These are things that we want to see also happening across the continent. It's not one or the other. It's all of the above. We tackle the informal settlements. We tackle the problems, of informality, while at the same time building a better future for our people. And by the way, climate resilient infrastructure, because it was also mentioned many times in this session, is almost 12 times more cost effective than traditional one, which would have to, due to the many or the frequent climate disasters that we would have to then relief work from climate disasters. So it's we are also, we do understand, economics as well on the continent. So we can make the calculations and understand that a climate resilient infrastructure is much more cost effective, and that's why we're also embracing it. And now the technology helps by the fact that the technology, for climate friendly and sustainable infrastructure has been, much more affordable than they used to be. So it's a firm yes. Africa is very much ready.
Thanks so much for that, Dr. Mani, pointing out that Africa is very much ready despite all the challenges that we have, and that we've proved that we are ready. And thank you for sharing the AU's strategies and agendas as well, and some of your points as well on some of the key points that we've touched on earlier today. Thanks so much for that. Her Excellency Dr. Mani Abu Zaid is the Commissioner for Infrastructure and Energy at the African Union Commission. All right, we now have another poll coming up. So can the organizers put that up very quickly? We'd like you, the audience, to please answer this. What area do you consider a priority in the development of African cities? Access to reliable and affordable housing, access to reliable quality electricity, adequate sanitation infrastructure, access to reliable and affordable internet connection, or access to affordable and sufficient public transportation. right? So go ahead and put in your votes, and we will come to the results of that shortly. I'd like to move on now to our final key point of the day. We heard from Her Excellency Dr. Mani, and one of the AU's objectives is to build a well and connected and integrated network of transport infrastructure that are able to support the provision of cost-effective, safe, secure, and sustainable services in order to enable the continent to realize its full economic potential and physical integration. So this question asks, what are the effective ways of adapting new roads and managing existing ones to improve climate resilience? Back to our panelists. Shepidi, I'd like you to come in here because I know that Africa 50 has invested in a historic railroad project connecting the DRC and the Republic of Congo. Are multifunctional regional focused infrastructure projects the ideal transport infrastructure for the future?
Thanks, Didi. I think, again, this question, it's not one or the other, right? I think it's a combination of looking at what infrastructure requirements are required nationally, and then how it is that we link our various countries together. I think with the signing and the ratification of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, it's critical that we are able to develop and deliver on multi-regional, multinational, cross-border infrastructure, as we're doing with what we call the 2 Congo Bridges, right? So with us needing to connect 1.3 billion people across the continent, it's critical. If I look at the 2 Congo Bridges, I mean, these are the 2 closest capital cities in the world. And currently, to get from one city to another, you need to take a small little boat to get across. So with the 2 Congo Bridges, we're really bringing together a population of about 25 million people between the 2 cities. We're looking to transport about, the current traffic between the 2 is about 750,000 people a year. We're looking to transport 340,000 tons of freight a year. And really, this can unlock such capacity for those 2 nations, but more importantly, incredible capacity across both East and West and North and South corridors. So I think it's a very clear affirmative yes, that multi-regional, but I think, as I said, it's a combination of both national. We need to be able to get our goods from the hinterlands to the requisite markets. We need to be able to get our goods from our own countries and export them to other nations. So it's a combination of the 2, not just one.
Thanks for that. And Mama, I know this is very much your area, so perhaps you could share tips and considerations for greener and smarter mobility solutions on the African continent.
Thank you, Didi. For sure, the first item on the green mobility is electrified mobility, because of we know the impact of the diesel in the cities. We know also the impact of the roads in the city and at the level of the continent. If we consider the shift that need to happen, it was mentioned previously, it is the shift to rail, because this is the smartest way to interconnect countries. This is known, it's not new, it's not a discovery. It has been that in the past, by the way, and the situation has made many of the countries in Africa not to continue investing on expanding the way on rail. So basically, this is changing. South Africa has done a great step with PRASA and the investment that they have engaged on the rail. And also, if we look at the connection between the countries, we today see interesting project connecting in Kenya, in Ethiopia, in Tanzania, between Mali and Senegal, in the Gulf of Guinea, some initiatives to transfer from the road to the rail a big part of the freight traffic. So we shall continue this effort of transferring to a lower carbon impacting mobility solution for the goods and for the passengers. So for us, this is a must. This does not mean that tomorrow morning we will eliminate the diesel or other means, but we have to have a sustained effort over years to move out of this type of mobility means.
Thanks so much, Mama. And Emmanuel, I'd like you to bring you in to close on this point for us and share your thoughts on this key point as well. Effective ways of adapting new roads and managing existing ones to improve climate resilience. Emmanuel.
Yeah, thanks. I think I'll go back to my earlier point on making it human-centered, right? But maybe I could use a specific example. So, I mean, I love the Lagos State government, for instance, but if you look at the Lagos State Strategic Transport Master Plan, I think the last one that was done was in 2012, if I'm not mistaken. I know it's been revamped now, right? But that master plan was done before the era of shared mobility, before everyone started talking about EVs and things like that. Now, the reason why I bring up this example is that in thinking about the future, right, it's then a question of, like I said earlier, acknowledging our current realities, right, but also asking, what does the future look like? And more importantly, what are the needs of the people, right? And then bring them to the table and bring all of the potential ideas and potential solutions. I think that that's the way to approach it, not just on a local level or a state level like Lagos. I think that on a national level, we also need to be having those kinds of conversations, and also across the continent, leveraging the free trade agreement and things like that, right? So in thinking about how we adapt, I don't know what the specific answer is, but I think that it needs to then be a conversation with those involved, first of all on the local level, but also across the continent as well, to say what makes the most sense, what direction do we want to go, right? What are our objectives and things like that, and then make the best decision based off of that.
All right, thank you so much to all of our panelists. That brings us to the end of the third key point. I'd like us to bring up the result of the interactive poll, which came up. So let's take a look at that. What area do you consider a priority in the development of African cities and its access to a reliable and affordable internet connection? About 30% of the votes. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for your participation there. Now we're moving on to questions, and I have got some interesting questions that have come through, and I'd like to bring back in, I think, Dr. Mani and Mr. Kone for this one. There's a comment that came in from someone in the audience, Mr. Famurewa. He says, in my view, for smart cities to work in Africa, they require a few anchor organizations or businesses that will provide the first wave of infrastructure needed in these cities. Governments can also invest, but they often lack the resources to do so. How do we incentivize organizations, including DFIs and businesses, to invest in smart cities? Should we have you come first, Mr. Kone, because we haven't heard from you in a while?
I'll let my sister take that first. Well, I'll let my sister take that first, please. Okay.
Ladies first? Okay.
Thank you. Okay. Well, you see, it's quite an interesting question in perspective, because but they said, the smart city to work, we should have an anchor organization and businesses that will provide the first wave of infrastructure needed. What is a smart city? What were we doing 10, 15 years ago? We were analog, paperwork. Today we do everything with a mobile. It means all our activity, daily activity, we have modernized it. Now, it's now the time for the city to modernize itself, automate its operations, mobility, traffic lighting, connectivity. And if we need to have an anchor, we have more than 50 countries. The reason why I'm saying this, some cities in Africa, for example, in Kigali, they did not need an anchor organization to make it happen. It is the city mayor, it is the council, it is basically the city itself, the way our mayors, or if I can say the municipality, need to be looking at the development. They need to change that mindset. They are still in the finite game while we are actually playing an infinite game, which is they think nothing will change, but things are changing. How are we accommodating the growth of this population? And that's what exactly what Emmanuel says. Have we taken the growth of the youth and the potential innovation, the potential capacity to develop, to innovate our city into our equations? The answer is no. So instead of saying really a anchor organization to show the infrastructure and so on and so forth, I think everything rise and fall on the leadership and the willing. If the willing is there, these projects, remember, these are technology-centric projects, which are most of the time bankable, using a PPP or any other form of financing that my sister Chipidi was talking about. So I don't really believe that we should be looking for anchor organization to giving lessons, because most of our cities are ready. The potential is there, the market is there, our youth are ready to work. So why don't we get on with it? That's my answer to that.
And Dr. Mani?
Thank you, Didi, and thank you for the question. It's not like we are inviting them or to encourage them to invest in smart cities. It's almost becoming the new norm. So we already, I mean, in the I didn't mention our program for infrastructure development in Africa. Smart technologies is one of the criteria for the selection of the projects. So the idea is, and it's not just about the infrastructure itself to be smart. What is really here missing, and maybe we did not discuss it enough, is who manages and how these cities are run, because it also means that you do have within, you know, the municipalities and or rethinking even the municipalities in ways that become, you know, and I'm not even exaggerating, they become like big rooms with large screens where intersections of different things, you know, happening at the same time, and following up, you know, in real time what is happening, and also responding in real time to what is happening. So which means what? Means that you need the human also capacity to run such infrastructure systems, and a new way of organizing even administratively your administrations that run the cities and infrastructures. To Mr. Sugu Farab's point earlier about, you know, municipalities and rethinking municipalities, it's rethinking, you know, the kind of accidents that happen, because they're not just the physical accidents, but you can also have problems like, you know, cybersecurity issues. So it's a completely different model. Or rethinking completely and totally fundamentally the model. Having said that, if not all the donors, most of the partners and ourselves, we're excited because this is what we want to invest in. We want to invest in cities or infrastructure that responds better to issues that arise, either if it's a road accident or other, but also fundamentally respond better and serve better the citizens. So it's not either or, but again, whether it's old, new, smart, non-smart, any investment means that you do have the right investment climate within the country to attract investors. All the good things that Chipidi was talking about. You need to get, you know, your investment policies right. to allow for to attract and incentivize either new ideas and creative minds, you know, to help you out, but also to help, you know, and support the investments that come in from the different sources. So the answer again is it is our role to also orient and show that this is the direction we're going into, and rethink our investment policies and investment climate to make sure it's incentivizes and attractive for investments in the kind of infrastructures and the kind of cities we want for our people.
All right, thank you so much for that, Dr. Mani. There's also a question that's coming for you, Shipidi. It says, Africa 50s, it's from Pierre Alain. Africa 50's project development arm has developed a strong portfolio of bankable projects, mainly in power, transport, and ICT. And you want to expand its core sector focus to include health and education. So what is Africa 50 project development strategy in these two sectors, so in health and education? JPD.
Thanks for that, Dizzy. I think actually I responded to it online. But for everybody else, I think the key thing here is indeed we have expanded our sectors to include both healthcare and education. And I think this was really in response to the fragility, the fragile state of our healthcare systems on the continent during COVID, as well as our education. I think we've always known that they were fragile, but this was clearly exacerbated, or was really brought to the fore during this time frame. So we're still in the early stages of developing the strategy, but I think what's key for us is really to see how it is we provide infrastructure that supports these two sectors. So keen to look at sort of cold chain logistics for healthcare, keen to look at telemedicine, keen to look at really disruptive technologies within both of these sectors. How is it that we can deliver education and content to people at home, to people at, to students at schools, etc. So keen to get ideas, keen to look at opportunities. I'd be keen to share my email with people who would be willing to share opportunities with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. Thank you to the audience for your participation. I think that this is a good place to leave things. And so I'd just like to say that, on behalf of the Africa CEO Forum, I'd like to thank all our panelists, our experts today, our guest speakers, and thank you so much, all of you, for sharing your view with us. And thank you to the viewers, the audience, for joining in as well. I wish we could continue the conversation, but we've got to end things now due to timing. But before you go, would like you to save the date for the Africa CEO Forum Annual Summit, which is taking place on the 21st and 22nd of March next year in Abidjan. Please save that date and register online at theafricaceoforum.com. All right, everyone. My name is Didi Akinyelure. It's been an honor to be your moderator for this session. Have a good day, everybody, and thank you.
Thank you, Didi, and thanks to all panelists. Thank you, Africa 50.
Thank you. Thank you to all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.